They're removing it. Eleanor stared at the email, her hands trembling. They're calling our garden an experiment, and they're going to bulldoze it. All of it. Sophia's voice crackled through the phone. What? They can't do that. According to this, they already have the contractors lined up. Eleanor's voice caught as she read the line again. Removal of the current community garden experiment and its replacement with a formal landscape design featuring uniform ornamental grasses. She set down her phone and moved to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer. Beyond her own carefully tended native plant garden, she could see a corner of the community space. Late-season asters bloomed in brilliant purple against the autumn light. A monarch butterfly, perhaps one of the last of the season, drifted between blooms. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool window pane. In her mind's eye, she could already see it all: bulldoze the carefully nurtured soil, the established perennials, the fruit trees just now reaching productive maturity, all replaced with what landscape architects euphemistically called low-maintenance plant material. Identical clumps of ornamental grasses and tidy shrubs pruned into submission. "I won't let them do this," she whispered, her botanist's hands curling into fists at her sides. "Not without a fight. Not without a fight." Dr. Eleanor Finch had spent 43 years coaxing life from soil. First as a university botanist specializing in sustainable agriculture. Later as the author of 3 definitive textbooks on native plant restoration. But it was only in retirement, tending the 2,500 square feet of earth nestled in the heart of Oakwood Estates, that she felt she'd found her true calling. She removed her gardening gloves and rubbed her aching fingers. Age spots dotted the back of her hands, each one earned through decades of working with plants. The Oakwood Community Garden had been nothing but a neglected field of crabgrass when Eleanor moved into the subdivision 5 years ago. Back then, it was simply an unused parcel marked future development on the community plans overlooked and untended in the 12 years since the neighborhood's construction. Eleanor smiled at the memory. Where others saw an eyesore, she had seen possibility. She could still remember the day she'd approached the previous HOA board, armed with carefully prepared sketches and a modest proposal. "Give me 1 growing season," she'd told them, trying to hide her nervousness. "If it doesn't work out, you can return it to lawn." They'd agreed, partly out of respect for her credentials, partly because maintaining that patch of stubborn weeds had been a persistent expense in a landscaping budget. Eleanor walked to her kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea, the scent of chamomile rising in gentle steam. Out the window, afternoon light gilded the garden's edges. 5 years of work. 5 years of transformation. What had once been barren ground now thrived as an explosion of colors, textures, and life. Raised cedar beds bursting with vegetables lined the sunny western edge. Native prairie plant scone flowers, black-eyed Susans, and milkweed created a haven for butterflies and bees in the center. A small orchard of dwarf fruit trees provided shade along the eastern border, while berry bushes and grapevines sprawled along the southern fence. Meandering paths of recycled brick connected it all, with handcrafted benches placed at strategic intervals where visitors could sit and absorb the garden's tranquility. Eleanor sipped her tea, the warm liquid steadying her nerves. More than just plants had flourished in this space. The garden had become the beating heart of Oakwood. Children from the nearby elementary school came for weekly lessons on ecology and food systems. Seniors from Oakwood's north section, many who lived alone, found purpose tending their own small plots. Young parents brought toddlers to pick strawberries in June and apples in September. Eleanor had even witnessed the beginning of a romance between 2 retirees who'd met while harvesting tomatoes. She smiled at the thought of Herb and Louise, now inseparable at 83 and 79. She set her teacup down with a decisive click against the saucer. This living tapestry of plants and people had become her legacy, more meaningful than her academic publications or research grants. She couldn't let it be destroyed. Eleanor returned to her tablet and read the offensive email once more. From board@oakwoodestates.org. Subject: Notice of Landscape Redesign Initiative Community Meeting. Dear Oakwood Estates residents, the Board of Directors is pleased to announce an exciting new initiative to enhance property values and community aesthetics through implementation of the Oakwood Uniform Landscape Design Plan. Starting next month, all common areas will be redesigned according to professional landscaping standards to present a cohesive, upscale appearance throughout our community. The redesign will include removal of the current community garden experiment and its replacement with a formal landscape design featuring uniform ornamental grasses, boxwood hedges, and seasonal flowering displays. A community information session will be held next Thursday at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse to present the design renderings and implementation timeline. Refreshments will be served. Sincerely, Richard Harmon, President, Oakwood Estates HOA. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she read the signature. Richard Harmon. The name alone made her temples throb. Everyone in Oakwood knew Richard. He'd moved into the largest model home on Oakwood Drive just 8 months ago and had promptly launched a campaign for HOA president, promising to elevate property values through aesthetic enhancement. Eleanor had skipped the election meeting, busy with the garden's spring planting. Now she regretted that decision immensely. She pushed back from the table and paced the length of her kitchen. Her slippers made soft shuffling sounds against the tile floor. This wasn't the first time she'd faced opposition. In academia, she'd weathered countless storms funding cuts, departmental politics, research challenges. But this felt different, more personal. This was her community, her neighbors, her garden. Eleanor stopped pacing and took a deep breath. The scientific mind that had served her for decades clicked into gear. If this was going to be a battle, she needed to know her resources, her allies, and her strategy. She retrieved a notebook and pen from the drawer. The scratch of pen against paper soothed her as she began to make her list. The board members were her first consideration. Richard Harmon, she knew, was likely a lost causa former executive who approached the HOA with corporate intensity. Melissa Washington was an unknown entity, having joined the board at the same time as Richard. Eleanor's pen hovered over the paper before continuing. The other 3 members were longer-term residents. Jim Parker, who Eleanor suspected would follow Richard's lead. Patricia Gonzalez, who had always been supportive of the garden but might be reluctant to oppose the president. And David Kim, who had 2 children that participated in the garden's educational programs. She tapped the pen against her lips, considering. Next, she listed her allies. Sophia was a given. The garden had at least 30 regular volunteers, though many were renters without voting rights in the HOA. The elementary school maintained an official partnership with the garden for their science curriculum. The local food pantry received regular donations. There were the seniors who relied on the garden for both fresh produce and social connection. And, of course, the many neighbors who simply enjoyed having a beautiful, productive space in their community. Eleanor nodded to herself. She had more support than she'd initially realized. Her strategy, though, would require more than just emotional appeals. Eleanor had been in academia long enough to know that data often spoke louder than passion. She opened her laptop, the blue light illuminating her determined expression. Her fingers, though slower with age, still moved efficiently across the keyboard as she began compiling figures. Pounds of produce harvested annually, volunteer hours contributed, educational visits logged, estimated increase in pollinator populations, storm water management benefits, and comparative maintenance costs between the garden and traditional landscaping. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her kitchen. Eleanor didn't notice. She worked with the focused intensity that had earned her tenure decades ago. After 2 hours, she sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. The document was comprehensive, compelling, and backed by solid research. She saved the file and closed her laptop with a satisfying click. Eleanor might be 72 years old, but she had survived 4 decades of academic politics, grant competitions, and departmental budget battles. Richard Harmon, she said to her empty kitchen, her voice steady with resolve, you're about to discover that this garden experiment comes with a formidable defender. The Oakwood Estates clubhouse buzzed with voices as Eleanor arrived on Thursday evening. She'd come 30 minutes early, yet a line already formed at the entrance. "Eleanor." Sophia. Chan waved from near the door. "I saved us seats in the front row." Eleanor adjusted her scarf and gripped her folder of materials tighter. "This turnout is remarkable." "Word spread fast after your email to the volunteer list," Sophia replied. "I think every gardener in Oakwood is here and plenty of others too." Inside, the usually spacious meeting room felt surprisingly intimate with bodies filling every available chair. People stood 3 deep along the walls, some peering in from the foyer. Eleanor settled into her saved seat, arranging her folder on her lap. The familiar weight of research and data gave her courage. Behind her, the room continued to fill, conversations overlapping into a steady hum of concern and determination. At precisely 7 o'clock, Richard Harmon strode to the podium. He wore a navy blazer and crisp button-down, looking more like he was addressing shareholders than neighbors. His confident smile faltered momentarily as he surveyed the unexpectedly large crowd. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming to learn about our exciting new landscape enhancement initiative." Richard gestured to a large display board covered with a black cloth. Oakwood Estates has always prided itself on being a premier community, and the board believes it's time our common areas reflected that status. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled away the cloth to reveal architectural renderings. Where the community garden had once thrived, sterile curves of hedgerow now arced around a central fountain plaza. Uniform grasses dotted the design like soldiers standing at attention. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She gripped her folder until her knuckles whitened. "As you can see," Richard continued, his voice smooth with practiced enthusiasm, "we've engaged Wallace Landscaping to create a cohesive design that will serve as a signature feature of our community. The installation will begin next month, with completion anticipated by early spring." "What about all the plants that are already there?" A voice called from the back of the room. Eleanor recognized Jake Miller, whose 10-year-old daughter had her own small plot in the children's section of the garden. Jake stood with his arms crossed, his expression troubled. Richard's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. "The current plantings are, unfortunately, not compatible with the new design aesthetic. However, residents will have 1 week prior to groundbreaking to relocate any personal plant material they wish to save." A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. Chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor raised her hand, her heart pounding despite her outward calm. Richard acknowledged her with a slight narrowing of his eyes. "Dr. Finch, I presume you have thoughts on this matter." "I do, thank you." Eleanor stood, conscious of all eyes turning toward her. She took a steadying breath. "The current plantings you refer to include over 200 established perennial species, many of which have taken years to mature and cannot simply be dug up and relocated. The garden also includes heritage fruit trees and berry bushes that provide food for both residents and our local food pantry." She pulled a chart from her folder, holding it up for all to see. In the past year alone, the garden has produced over 2,000 pounds of fresh produce, hosted 42 educational sessions for local schools, and provided over 3,000 volunteer hours of physical activity for our residents, particularly our senior population, who benefit immensely from this form of exercise and social interaction. Eleanor could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she held the chart. The room had gone completely silent. Richard's smile became strained. "While those are admirable statistics, Dr. Finch, the board has determined that a more structured landscaping approach will better serve our community's long-term interests and property values." "On what evidence?" Eleanor asked calmly. Richard blinked. "I am sorry. On what evidence have you determined that replacing a productive community garden with ornamental grasses will better serve our interests or increase property values?" Eleanor's question hung in the air. She could hear the soft whir of the heating system and someone coughing discreetly in the back row. Before Richard could respond, David Kim spoke up from his place at the board table. "That's actually a fair question. Richard, did Wallace provide any comparative data on property value impacts? Richard shuffled some papers, the rustle audible in the quiet room. A faint sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead. Wallace Landscaping has extensive experience in upscale communities. Their professional judgment. So, no data, Eleanor interjected. She reached in her folder again. Meanwhile, I have here 3 peer-reviewed studies showing that access to community gardens increases nearby property values by an average of 9.4% compared to similar properties without such amenities. She walked forward, her sensible shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, and handed copies to each board member. The paper made a satisfying snap as she placed them on the table. Patricia Gonzalez, examining the studies, looked up with interest. These are quite compelling, Eleanor. I wasn't aware the impact was so significant. Richard cleared his throat. His ties suddenly seemed too tight around his neck. While academic studies are interesting, they don't necessarily reflect our specific community's needs. The current garden, while well-intentioned, presents maintenance challenges and aesthetic inconsistencies. That's simply not accurate. Sophia Chun stood beside Eleanor, her voice firm despite her usual shyness. Our volunteer group logs every maintenance hour. The garden requires 32% less water than traditional landscaping would for the same square footage, and our maintenance costs are covered entirely by our volunteer group and produce sales at zero expense to the HOA. Eleanor gave her friend a grateful smile, then turned back to face the room. Hands were rising throughout the audience. A young mother stood, her toddler balanced on her hip. My son wouldn't touch vegetables before we started growing them ourselves. Now he eats cherry tomatoes like candy. An elderly man with a cane rose slowly from his seat. After my wife died, that garden plot saved me. Gave me reason to get up in the morning. Something to care for. His voice cracked slightly before he sat back down. The elementary school science teacher spoke about hands-on learning opportunities that couldn't be replicated in a classroom. A teenager described the business skills she'd learned selling garden produce at the community market. One by one, community members rose to defend what had clearly become much more than just a collection of plants. Eleanor listened, her heart swelling with each testimony. As the stories continued, she watched the board members' reactions. Patricia and David were engaged, clearly moved. Jim Parker looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the community members and Richard. Melissa Washington remained impassive, though her pen moved constantly, taking detailed notes. And Richard's jaw was set in a rigid line, earlier polish giving way to barely concealed frustration. His fingers tapped an impatient rhythm against the podium. When the community input finally subsided, Richard stood again. He straightened his blazer, a gesture Eleanor recognized as self-comfort. While we appreciate everyone's enthusiasm, I must remind you that the board has authority over common area decisions. We've invested considerable resources in developing this plan, and contracts have already been signed with Wallace Landscaping. Eleanor stepped forward again, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. What if we could show that maintaining the garden would better serve the community, both financially and socially? Richard smiled thinly. The decision has been made, Dr. Finch. The board voted unanimously. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor looked directly at David and Patricia. Is that true? Was the vote unanimous? David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The microphone picked up his nervous swallow. We were presented with the landscape plans as a package. The community garden aspect wasn't specifically highlighted during our discussion. Patricia nodded in agreement, her earrings catching the light as she moved. I certainly didn't understand that the entire garden would be removed. I thought we were discussing enhancement, not elimination. Richard's face flushed slightly. The plans were clearly presented. I moved to reconsider the vote, David interrupted, looking directly at Patricia, who nodded. I second that motion, she said firmly. Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped the podium. The wood creaked under his fingers. This is highly irregular. The contracts are signed. Most contracts have escape clauses, Melissa Washington spoke for the first time, her voice measured. As treasurer, I'd like to review the financial implications of both options before proceeding. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A small victory, but significant. The meeting ended in a stalemate, with the board agreeing to reconsider the decision at their next meeting in 2 weeks. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped to thank Eleanor, to offer help, to share stories of what the garden meant to them. She accepted their words with grace, but inside, she knew this was only the beginning. Richard Harmon, glowering from across the room as he packed his presentation materials, had not become successful in business by conceding defeat easily. Morning dew sparkled on spider webs stretched between aster stems as Eleanor knelt in the community garden. The earth felt cool and damp through her gardening pants. She hummed softly as she worked, carefully dividing clumps of autumn-blooming flowers. A shadow fell across her work. Eleanor looked up, squinting against the morning light, to find Richard Harmon standing over her. His tailored chinos and polished loafers looked absurdly out of place among the garden beds. "Dr. Finch," he said, his tone formal but not hostile. "May we speak?" Eleanor rose slowly, her knees protesting the movement. She brushed soil from her gardening gloves and faced him squarely. "Of course." Richard surveyed the garden with critical eyes. His nose wrinkled slightly at the earthy smell of compost from a nearby bin. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I want you to understand that my goal is simply to ensure Oakwood maintains certain standards. When potential buyers drive through, first impressions matter. And you don't believe this creates a positive impression?" Eleanor gestured to the vibrant landscape around them. Late-season vegetables hung heavy on their vines. Native grasses swayed gently in the breeze. The last monarchs of the season drifted among purple ironweed blossoms. A blue jay called from the apple trees, its harsh cry cutting through the morning quiet. "It's chaotic," Richard said after a moment. His fingers fidgeted with his watch strap. "Unplanned. Properties like Oakwood thrive on consistency and predictability." Eleanor smiled slightly. A chickadee landed on a nearby sunflower head, pecking at the seeds with delicate precision. "Nature is many things, Richard, but it's rarely tidy. That doesn't make it less valuable." "Value is precisely my concern," he countered, his voice taking on the confidence of familiar territory. "I've invested significantly in my home here, as have many residents. We have a responsibility to protect that investment." Eleanor nodded, surprising him. "I don't disagree." A breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of autumn sage. "But value isn't just measured in dollars. This garden provides food security, education, beauty, wildlife habitat, and community connection. Those are real values too." Richard sighed. His shoulders relaxed slightly beneath his expensive shirt. "Look, I'm not unsympathetic to your attachment to this project. Perhaps we could find a compromise, reduce the garden's footprint, integrate more structured elements, create a more managed appearance." Eleanor considered his words carefully. A robin landed nearby, cocking its head as if listening to their negotiation. "I'd be open to discussing modifications that preserve the garden's core functions. But I can't support anything that fundamentally undermines its ecological diversity or community accessibility." "Then I suggest you prepare a counter-proposal before the next board meeting," Richard said, his tone making it clear the conversation was ending. "Something that addresses the aesthetic concerns while preserving your ecological priorities." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him. "Richard, have you ever actually walked through the garden? Not just around it, but through it?" He paused, one foot on the path, the other still on the grass. "I can see it perfectly well from the path." "That's like judging a book by glancing at its cover," Eleanor replied. "If you're going to make decisions about this space, you owe it to yourself and the community to experience it properly." Richard hesitated. His watch caught the sunlight as he checked the time. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine. Show me what you think I'm missing." Eleanor suppressed a smile of triumph. "Follow me, then. Mind the muddy spots, those loafers look expensive." For the next hour, Eleanor guided Richard through the garden's meandering paths. The morning warmed around them as the sun climbed higher. She explained the design principles that might not be apparent to an untrained eye. She showed him how the seemingly random placement of plants actually followed careful ecological groupings, plants that supported each other's growth, deterred specific pests, or provided complementary nutrients to the soil. She pointed out the deliberate succession of blooms that ensured pollinators had food sources from early spring through late fall, and how the varying heights and textures created habitats for beneficial insects and birds. Throughout the tour, Eleanor watched Richard closely. His responses were terse, his questions technical rather than engaged. Yet occasionally, something would flicker across his face, a momentary softening when a monarch butterfly landed near them, a slight pause when he tasted a sun-warmed raspberry Eleanor offered. These weren't the reactions of someone unmoved, but of someone fighting to remain unmoved. They encountered Max, a retired widower who was harvesting kale from his plot. His gnarled hands worked with surprising dexterity among the crinkled leaves. "Garden saved me after Helen passed," Max explained, not looking up from his work. "Been 5 years now. Empty house gets real quiet. Out here, even when nobody's talking, it ain't silent. Bees buzzing, birds singing, life happening." Richard nodded politely, but said little. His polished shoe tapped against the path. "Your daughter's family lives nearby, don't they?" Eleanor asked as they walked on. Richard looked surprised, his controlled expression slipping. "Yes, my daughter and son-in-law. They have Emma, my granddaughter." "How old is Emma now?" 7, Richard replied, a note of genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time. His posture relaxed slightly. "Smart as a whip. Already reading chapter books." Eleanor nodded toward a family working in the children's section. A father helped his young son plant carrot seeds, carefully measuring the distance between each one. Kids thrive in gardens. There's something about growing things that connects with them instinctively. Our children's programs are always oversubscribed. Richard watched the family for a moment, his expression unreadable. The father was laughing at something the child said, their faces close together over the soil. Then Richard checked his watch with deliberate motion. "It's nearly noon. I should be going." "Just a little further," Eleanor encouraged, touching his sleeve lightly. "There's one more section I'd like to show you." She led him to the children's garden area, where each child had their own small plot marked with a hand-painted sign. Richard followed, his stiff posture betraying his impatience, when suddenly he stopped short. A hand-painted sign, decorated with wobbly sunflowers and uneven lettering, identified Emma Harmon's sunflower house, a circular arrangement of giant sunflowers creating a natural playhouse with a small opening as a doorway. For a moment, Richard stood perfectly still, staring at the sign. The breeze ruffled his carefully combed hair. Something shifted in his face, not just surprise, but a complex emotion Eleanor couldn't quite name. He reached out to touch one of the massive sunflower heads, its face turned toward the sun, seeds nearly ready for harvest. "Emma did this?" he asked, his voice different now, softer, almost vulnerable. "She's been coming with your daughter for the Saturday morning children's program," Eleanor explained gently. "She designed the sunflower house herself. Those are mammoth Russians that can grow over 10 feet tall. Emma's are some of the best in the garden this year." Richard stood silent, his hands still resting on the sunflower stem. His fingers traced the rough texture of the stalk with unusual gentleness. A child's laughter rang out from another part of the garden, and Eleanor saw him swallow hard. "I didn't know," he said finally, almost to himself. Then, as if remembering where he was and who he was with, he straightened, smoothing his shirt with a practiced gesture. His professional mask slipped back into place, though it seemed less convincing now. "I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Thank you for the informative tour, Dr. Finch." As he walked away, his stride purposeful but somehow less certain than before, Eleanor watched with a glimmer of hope. In that brief, unguarded moment, she had seen something in Richard Harmon that all his property value charts and landscape renderings couldn't conceal: a grandfather who cared deeply about his granddaughter's joy. Perhaps there was a chink in Richard Harmon's armor after all, one that had nothing to do with property values or aesthetic consistency. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor worked tirelessly. Her kitchen table disappeared under maps, drawings, and research papers. Her computer remained open day and night as she refined her proposal. With Sophia's help, she created detailed drawings showing how the garden's perimeter could incorporate more structured elements, a uniform hedge border, perhaps, or a more formal entrance while maintaining the ecological diversity within. Eleanor's fingers cramped from writing emails. Her voice grew hoarse from phone calls. But slowly, support gathered like clouds before rain. She collected letters from the elementary school principal, the food pantry director, and even the police department, which noted lower vandalism rates in communities with active garden programs. She compiled a financial analysis comparing the volunteer-maintained garden's costs with those of the proposed professional landscaping, both initial installation and ongoing maintenance. But her most powerful strategy emerged from an unexpected source. 13-year-old Zach Morris, who arrived at her door one evening with his laptop. "Mrs. Finch," he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot on her porch. "I've been recording videos of the garden for my science project. All year long. I thought maybe they could help." Eleanor invited him in, serving him lemonade and cookies at her cluttered table. When he opened his laptop and showed her the footage, she gasped. Zach had captured the garden through the changing seasons, from every angle imaginable. Drone shots showed the overall design from above. Close-ups revealed bees pollinating blossoms in breathtaking detail. Time-lapse sequences compressed months of growth into seconds of miracle. "Zach," she said, "this is extraordinary." The boy blushed, pleased. "I could edit it into something short." For the meeting, together, they created a 5-minute presentation showing the garden's full life cycle. They included footage of community members of all ages engaged in the space planting, harvesting, learning, connecting. The video ended with a simple statistic: Oakwood Community Garden, serving 78% of residents through food, education, or recreation. By the time the board meeting arrived, Eleanor felt as prepared as she could be. Her folder of materials was organized meticulously. Zach's video had been tested 3 times on the community center's projection system. The turnout was even larger than before. Every seat filled 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Community members wore handmade buttons bearing sunflower images and the slogan, "Grow Community, not just grass." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering her strength. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Richard called the meeting to order with the same polished authority as before, but Eleanor noticed subtle differences in his demeanor. His typical confidence seemed more studied than natural. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. He avoided looking directly at the garden's supporters filling the room. "As you know, we're here to reconsider the board's decision regarding the community garden space," he began. "Before we open to community input, I'd like to acknowledge that the board has received Dr. Finch's counterproposal, as well as numerous letters from residents and community organizations." Eleanor sat straight in her front row seat, folder in hand, prepared for battle. But before she could request speaking time, Richard continued. "Additionally, the board has reviewed the financial implications of both the original landscape plan and the modified proposal that would preserve the garden." "Melissa, would you summarize your findings?" Melissa Washington, with her accountant's precision, detailed the cost comparisons. The Wallace landscaping contract would require an initial investment of $87,000, followed by annual maintenance costs of approximately $22,000. In contrast, maintaining the community garden in its current form, even with the proposed enhancements to its perimeter, would cost the HOA nothing, as the volunteer group covered all expenses through their plant sale fundraisers and produce market. Furthermore, Melissa added, tapping her calculator for emphasis, "I've analyzed property sales within Oakwood over the past 5 years and found that homes within viewing distance of the community garden sold for an average of 7.3% more than comparable properties elsewhere in the development. While this is correlational rather than necessarily causal, It does suggest that the garden is not negatively impacting property values and may, in fact, be enhancing them. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. She exchanged a startled glance with Sophia, who squeezed her hand in silent celebration. Richard nodded stiffly. Thank you, Melissa. Patricia, you've reviewed the community impact aspects. Patricia Gonzalez spoke next, highlighting the garden's role in building community connections, particularly for seniors and families with young children. She cited research on the mental health benefits of community gardening and access to green spaces. In my 6 years on this board, she concluded, her voice warm with conviction, I've never seen a common area amenity that serves such a diverse cross-section of our residents or generates such passionate support. Eleanor exchanged bewildered glances with Sophia. This was not the contentious meeting they had prepared for. Her extensive notes remained untouched in her lap. Richard cleared his throat. Before we move to a vote, I'd like to make a personal statement. He paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. His hands gripped the sides of the podium. As many of you know, I campaigned for board president on a platform of enhancing Oakwood's appeal and property values. I still believe that's an important goal. However, he looked around the room, his gaze finally settling on a point near the back where Eleanor knew his daughter sat with young Emma. The little girl waved enthusiastically, and Richard's formal demeanor cracked slightly. However, I've come to recognize that community value can't always be measured in traditional metrics. Over the past 2 weeks, I've spent more time in the garden, observing how it's used and what it means to residents. Richard paused, and for a moment, Eleanor saw a flicker of internal struggle cross his face, a man accustomed to certainty finding himself on unfamiliar ground. He loosened his tie slightly. I've spoken with many of you and heard your stories, he continued, his voice softer now. And I've watched my granddaughter tend sunflowers. He cleared his throat again, but this time it seemed less a professional habit and more an attempt to master emotion. His voice, when he continued, was rough around the edges. Last weekend, Emma took me to see her sunflower house. She told me she'd planted it herself, that she'd learned how to measure the spacing between seeds, how deep to plant them, when to water. His voice caught slightly. Richard paused, taking a sip of water from the glass on the podium. She showed me a journal where she'd recorded their growth each week with little drawings. She's 7 years old, and she's conducting what amounts to a scientific study because of this garden. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor saw several people exchange surprised glances at this unexpectedly personal revelation from their usually formal HOA president. Emma has been having some difficulty at school, Richard continued, addressing the room, but seeming to speak mainly to himself. His knuckles whitened against the podium. Some girls have been unkind to her. My daughter tells me the garden is the one place Emma feels completely confident and accepted. Her sunflower house is her refuge. He looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. The fluorescent lights revealed unexpected moisture in his eyes. Dr. Finch helped me understand something important. What good is property value if we sacrifice the soul of our community to achieve it? The room had fallen completely silent. Every person caught in the gravity of this unexpected vulnerability. Eleanor could hear the tick of the wall clock, the soft whoosh of the ventilation system. Therefore, Richard continued, visibly pulling himself back to his more familiar, businesslike demeanor. I'd like to propose a modified plan. We will maintain the community garden in its current footprint, with some enhancements to its perimeter for a more cohesive appearance from the street. We'll redirect a portion of the landscape budget to improve the garden's infrastructure irrigation, composting facilities, and accessibility features for our senior gardeners. The room erupted in applause. The sudden noise startled Eleanor, making her jump in her seat. Parents hugged their children. Elderly gardeners dabbed at their eyes. Sophia gripped Eleanor's hand so tightly it almost hurt. Eleanor sat stunned, her carefully prepared arguments unnecessary, her battle over before it had truly begun. The folder in her lap suddenly felt heavy, its contents rendered obsolete by this unexpected turn of events. When the noise subsided, Richard raised his hand. The room quieted immediately. "There's one condition to this proposal," he said. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Eleanor felt her shoulders tense. "The garden needs more structured oversight," Richard began. Murmurs of concern rippled through the audience. Eleanor's heart sank. "Not to restrict its creativity," Richard added quickly, seeing the reaction from the crowd, "but to ensure its continued success and integration with other community features. I'd like to propose the formation of a garden committee with Dr. Finch as its chairperson, if she's willing." All eyes turned to Eleanor. The sudden attention made her cheeks warm. She rose slowly, still processing this unexpected turn of events. Her knees felt strangely weak beneath her. "I would be honored," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I'd suggest a co-chair arrangement with representation from different segments of our community, perhaps a parent, a senior, a food security advocate, and yes," she looked directly at Richard as she added this last part, "someone with an eye for aesthetics and property values." Richard actually smiled a genuine expression that transformed his typically stern face. The smile reached his eyes, softening the lines at their corners. "An excellent suggestion. We'll work out the details of committee formation after the vote." The board's vote was unanimous in favor of the modified plan. David Kim's hand shot up immediately. Patricia Gonzalez nodded enthusiastically. Even Jim Parker, after a moment's hesitation, raised his hand in agreement. As the meeting adjourned amid celebration, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Neighbors hugged her. Children tugged at her sleeves to tell her about their garden plans for spring. The room buzzed with excited conversation. When the crowd thinned, Eleanor made her way to where Richard stood conversing with board members. Their eyes met across the room, and he excused himself to meet her halfway. "That was unexpected," she said when he turned to her. The overhead lights cast shadows under his eyes, revealing his fatigue. "For both of us, I think," Richard replied. "May I ask what changed your mind?" Richard glanced toward his daughter and granddaughter. Emma was proudly showing off her sunflower button to another child. "I've spent my entire career looking at spreadsheets and property valuations," he said quietly. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm against his thigh. "I'm good at it. I understand it. But watching Emma in that garden..." He shook his head slightly. A lock of his carefully combed hair fell across his forehead, making him look suddenly more human. "It made me reconsider what kind of legacy I want to leave in this community-sterile perfection, or something that actually nurtures the next generation." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken vulnerability in his admission. "The garden has a way of teaching us what we need most to learn." "Besides," Richard added, his typical businesslike manner returning like a familiar coat he'd momentarily set aside, "Melissa's financial analysis was compelling. I can't argue with those numbers." Eleanor smiled. "Of course not." Spring arrived in a riot of color in the Oakwood Community Garden. The winter had been busy with planning and preparation. The newly formed garden committee co-chaired by Eleanor and, surprisingly, Richard himself had worked through the cold months to refine their vision for the space. Eleanor stepped carefully along the freshly mulched path, her cane sinking slightly into the soft ground. The morning air carried the sweet scent of damp earth and new growth. The changes were subtle but significant. A uniform stone border now defined the garden's perimeter, giving it a more polished appearance from the street while preserving the ecological diversity within. The stones caught the morning light, warm honey-colored against the fresh green of emerging plants. New cedar signs explained the garden's zones and purposes for visitors. Eleanor paused to straighten one that had tilted slightly overnight. Her fingers traced the wood grain, smooth under her touch. Wider, accessible paths accommodated wheelchairs and walkers. A proper irrigation system, disguised with natural materials, reduced water usage while improving plant health. The telltale green of seedlings poked through the soil in neat rows. On garden opening day, Eleanor stood back and watched with quiet satisfaction as residents streamed in for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The spring breeze carried fragments of excited conversation. Children raced to the expanded children's garden, their laughter bubbling like spring water over stones. The new living tunnels of bean vines stood ready for climbing, though the plants were still small. Sunflower houses were marked out with colorful flags where giants would grow by midsummer. Seniors settled onto new ergonomic benches designed for easier rising and sitting. Mrs. Abernathy, who had trouble with her hips, sighed with relief as she sat down, her gardening tools arranged neatly beside her. Families claimed their plots, ready to plant the seedlings started in the community greenhouse, another new addition, funded partially by the redirected landscape budget and partially by community donations. Through its glass walls, Eleanor could see trays of green life waiting to be transplanted. A familiar figure approached, his usual business attire replaced by khaki pants and a casual button-down with rolled sleeves. Richard's granddaughter skipped ahead of him, her braids bouncing with each step as she ran toward her designated sunflower spot, now expanded to include a small vegetable patch of her own. "You must be pleased," he said, surveying the vibrant scene. "It seems your garden experiment has become a permanent institution." Eleanor smiled. Birds called from nearby trees, punctuating their conversation with trills and whistles. The garden was never really the experiment, Richard. The experiment was whether a community could recognize its value before it was lost. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. A smudge of dirt marked his cheek where Emma had apparently touched him with garden-soiled hands. Some lessons are worth learning, even for stubborn former executives. Together, they watched as Emma carefully planted a seedling under the guidance of Mrs. Abernathy. The child's small hands worked with surprising gentleness, patting the soil around the fragile stem. "Careful, sweetheart." "That's it, Mrs. Abernathy encouraged. Just like that." Emma beamed with pride as she finished. The transfer of knowledge between generations flowed as natural and necessary as the seasons themselves. In the rich soil of compromise, something more valuable than either uniform hedges or unfettered meadows had taken root: a genuine community, growing together in all its messy, vibrant glory. The garden had been saved, but in the process of saving it, they had cultivated something even more precious: the understanding that true community, like the most resilient ecosystem, thrives not on uniformity, but on diversity, not on control, but on connection. Eleanor took a deep breath, filling her lungs with spring air. Her bones ached slightly from the winter's work, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. As she moved through the garden that day, helping new gardeners position their seedlings and explaining companion planting strategies, she felt a sense of triumph deeper than any academic achievement in her long career. Her hand traced the edge of a raised bed, fingertips registering the grain of the wood. Here was her true legacy, not just in the plants that would feed this community for years to come, but in the roots of connection that would sustain it through whatever challenges the future might bring. And in a corner plot, carefully tending his newly installed herb garden, Richard Harmon was learning a lesson no business success had ever taught him: that growth, whether of plants or people or communities, requires not rigid control, but patient nurturing, not uniformity, but celebration of difference, not isolation, but interconnection. He looked up, caught Eleanor watching him, and raised his garden trowel in salute. Sunlight glinted off the metal. Eleanor smiled and returned the gesture with her own tool. The garden would continue to grow and change, as gardens do. The scarlet runner beans would climb their trellises. The tomatoes would sweeten in the summer sun. The sunflowers would turn their faces to follow the light across the sky. But the seeds of understanding planted during this conflict would yield harvest for generations to come, a living testament to the power of putting down roots in what matters most. Eleanor watched a butterfly land on a newly planted milkweed seedling. Its wings pulsed slowly, catching the light. "Welcome home," she whispered.